Let's go ahead and get started so we can still have a break for dinner this evening, regain our energy for tonight. Oh yeah. Thank you for joining me in a half-hearted attempt of the mythical slow clap. You know, that celebrated tradition that we use to bring and celebrate that everyday hero, like the little guy who's undersized and gets to come out into the football field, where it starts with one clap and then builds to an applause and roar of many. I think it's a great tradition for us to think about in the peace movement, because it's everyday heroes that really make this work happen. I want to start with a little bit of a commercial interruption before we start our panel. I want to bring your attention to this wonderful book that was in your packages today. This is World Beyond War's A Global Security System, an Alternative to War. It's not just another brochure for you to take home. This was developed, this edition, 2017 edition, our third edition, was revised and developed by David Swanson and Patrick Hiller with the input of several of you in this audience, as well as other members of the World Beyond War community. And I just want to point out how important this book is. This book is World Beyond War's attempt to provide analysis of the war system. We've got that pretty much figured out. An outline of an alternative global security system, one that's where peace is pursued by peaceful means, what we're trying to explore and achieve today. But this isn't just an outline of some new radical visions. This contains proven nonviolent alternatives to war, components of a real peace system. And this also contains World Beyond War's proposed strategy for establishing this new system and for accelerating the development of the cultures of peace that already exist within our world and our communities. And I just want to point out that this is a work in progress. This is, again, our third edition. It's a living document. We intend to be updating it every year, and you are the first recipients of this book. It will be live and for sale on our website very shortly. But the reason I come to World Beyond War, I should introduce myself. I'm Tony Jenkins. I'm the education coordinator for World Beyond War. And my background in context and work has always been in peace education and peace studies. And the reason I came to World Beyond War was the motivation that this book brought to me. I'm deeply inspired by the vision of creating this alternative new system, and it's always been part of my own teaching work. And as Dale Dewar reminded us this morning, change the story, change the future. That's what this book has the potential to do, and that's why we continue to work on it. Another one of my heroes, sociologist and peace researcher and peace educator Elise Boulding, always would say, we can't work for a world we can't imagine. And that's what this book also helps us to do. So the substance of this book can help us in that direction. This book, we've been told by many people, is insanely dense and complex, maybe intimidatingly so for some of you. But is it more scary to read this than to stare down nuclear apocalypse, right? I think it's something we can handle. It's pretty reasonable to get through the 120 or so pages of this book. We firmly believe that this should be, and no, not should be, must be, required reading in high schools, in social studies classes, in university-based peace studies program, graduate and undergraduate, community groups and religious groups, and dare I say it, in the US Congress. But I think to read this is not enough. It's not enough to understand it. We must own it. We must believe in the vision that's contained in these pages for it to become a reality. That's part of telling and writing that new story. And so we must see ourselves as part of what is in these pages. And so we must study it to learn it. We must study it more deeply. I want to make one more commercial announcement. So this is a t-shirt that World Beyond War has made that we don't have for sale here. It's a new one, and it's my favorite design for a couple of obvious reasons as an educator. If you can see down at the bottom, it says "Disarm Your Mind." I'm feeling very self-conscious now being a t-shirt model. But you can see this gentleman's head is filled with the Pentagon, the war system. And this gentleman in the lab coat with a very nice World Beyond War logo is chiseling away at the war system and ripping it out of your mind. I love this t-shirt. I mean, sometimes I think my role as a peace educator is around helping to disarm the minds of our youth. But there's something not quite right with the context of this. I mean, learning doesn't really happen this way. We don't just chisel things out, and we don't just stick things into empty vessels. That's not what real learning looks like, right? It's something much more deep than that. It requires some kind of engagement, some reflection with ourselves and our world and our understanding of it. It requires meaning making. We aren't these blank, empty slates. And so we wanted to think about this book and how to make it even more meaningful for us, to take all the wonderful substance in it and give context and inquiry that will help us move from concern to action, from knowing to creating, and this is very different. We wanted us to be able to engage in it in a kind of learning that requires reflection and connection with ourselves and with other people. The kind of learning that moves us in this direction requires discovery, creativity, visioning, planning, engaging in action, and thinking about it all again. And so this is why we've developed a companion online study guide called Study War No More, which you can see up here on the screen behind you. This is a concerned citizen study and action guide for a global security system, an alternative to war. We quietly released this online earlier this week, but this is our coming out party, the official launch, to share with you this wonderful new tool and resource that we hope you will bring into your work. This study guide is a project of World Beyond War in partnership with the Global Campaign for Peace Education. So it follows this book very closely and supports deeper learning through guided inquiries to help us to assess the war system even more, to assess these alternative approaches that are being experimented with and tested, and to consider the whole of what a new peace system can look like and how, more importantly, we might build it together coalitionally. I want to show you just a couple of little items. I'll let you poke around with it, but I want to point out something else that's unique to this special project that we've been working on. It's a project that we've done in partnership with a number of people who are in the room, but several people from around the world: educators, activists, peace builders, peace and security people, environmentalists. And we have a global network of study and action partners who are featured in each of these lessons with short video introductions telling about their work to make it tangible, to let you know that these alternatives aren't just things that we're dreaming of, that they're tested, they work, and there are real people just like you who are doing it. So it's really wonderful for you to have an opportunity to jump online. A few of the people who are here today are part of this group. Lindsay Kashgarian, who we heard earlier this afternoon in the previous panel, David Swanson, Ann Wright are among some of the people here, but you can see from this image there are some 22 different partners that we worked with from around the world in creating and designing this wonderful work. So this is not just a tool for studying and discussing this book. It's something bigger than that, we think. We think that we still don't know all the answers. This is evident by the discussions that we're having here this weekend. That we really need for more people to engage in this collective inquiry together so we can find the appropriate solutions. So it's designed for you to give us feedback, to share your ideas of what an alternative peace system can look like. So with that, I want to leave you an invitation, and I want to show you just a short little promo video that we have, and then we will turn it over and transition to our panel.
after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more.
Thank you. All right, so shift hats to my moderator. And I welcome you to this panel on divestment from fossil fuels and weapons. And today we have three amazing, as all of our speakers have been throughout the weekend, three amazing speakers and activists who have been engaged in this work, some from far longer than I've even been alive, probably. Today we're going to hear from Terry Crawford-Browne, Jonathan King, and Susi Snyder. And just a few very quick words about each of these individuals. I'll introduce them all here at the beginning, so I don't take up any more of your precious time. So we're going to hear first from Terry, who is a South African and a peace activist, interestingly enough, a former international banker, who with Archbishop Tutu launched the International Banking Sanctions Campaign against Apartheid in 1985. And as a member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, he supports the BDS campaign as a nonviolent initiative to balance the scales between Israeli and Palestinian negotiators. And interestingly, I invited the panelists to share with me some kind of word about how they got into this work. And Terry shared, a rather nice long story. I'll just give a 10-second version of it here. That his engagement started with his sons. So during the apartheid days, all white men had to serve 2 years conscription plus camps. And boys would be registered at school during the year that they turned 16 or at 15 to go into the army at 18. The penalty for refusal for this was 6 years imprisonment, is that right? So Terry told his son's school, an Anglican church school, that under no circumstances was his son to be registered for conscription. And they replied, well, the law says, and he told them in pretty strict terms, that the law also says I am his guardian until he is 21. So under no circumstances should a 15-year-old make such a decision. And of course, they backed down. Jonathan Allen King is a professor of molecular biology at MIT, where he has long taught biochemistry and directed biomedical research on protein misfolding and human disease. That seems like a perfect fit for our panel. But you're wondering why he's here, right? He is also a co-author of the Science for Peace Resolution of the World Council of Churches, calling for continued nuclear disarmament. Subsequently, he was a leader of the National Campaign for Biomedical Scientists to press the Senate to ratify the Biological Weapons Convention, which culminated in Senator John Glenn's shepherding passage of the treaty through Congress in 1989. But also, in terms of the topic of this panel, as a local citizen of Cambridge, Massachusetts, he led the divestment of the city's pension fund from corporations involved in the production of nuclear weapons. And finally, we have Susi Snyder, who is the Nuclear Disarmament Program Manager for PAX in the Netherlands. Ms. Snyder is the primary author and coordinator of the Don't Bank on the Bomb annual report on nuclear weapon producers and the institutions that finance them. She has also served as the previously as the Secretary General of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And let me tell you a wonderful little bit about her as well. Her personal tidbit is that she also worked in a corporate bank. And she looked around one day and noticed that not a single colleague of hers was smiling, not a single one. And in fact, she couldn't remember when anyone ever smiled. So she left in search of something that would make her smile, and oddly enough, got involved in working with indigenous communities fighting to protect their traditional home from nuclear weapons. Isn't it amazing that people who are oppressed and suffering are able to smile all the time? And working in this demanding an end to the suffering caused by nuclear weapons, it brought more of a smile to her face than those who worked only to put some cash in their pockets. So we have Susie as well. So I turn it over to start our panel to Terry.
Thank you very much, Tony. If I may actually start with a further add to the commercial for this amazing program. The cover story, the cover picture for this is actually by a former South African conscientious objector who left South Africa in 1983 as a 19-year-old cameraman and who is now a film producer in Hollywood. But I was organizing a conference for War Resisters International in Cape Town in 2014 and was introduced to Ralph Zeman, and you'll see it's mentioned here that he did the cover. And the logo for War Resisters International was a broken rifle. He said, well, I can do a broken AK-47 and wrap it in US dollar bills to symbolize the war industry. And we were holding the conference in the old Cape Town City Hall, so we arranged to have a 120-meter wheat paste image, the biggest wheat paste image in the world, pasted onto the parade in front of the Cape Town City Hall and the Cape Town main library. So this picture you have is actually taken from a drone, hence the perspective of it. And it was there for 6 weeks before it was steamed off, but Ralph and I are now talking about having a permanent sculpture of this, hoping to raise the money for a sculpture 5 meters by 2 meters. Hopefully we'll have one in Cape Town, but maybe you would like one in Washington as well. Thank you. Now, if I may, you will all remember in the 1980s, the perception was that South Africa and the apartheid system would end up in a racial bloodbath and civil war. That was the way we were going. We had a mad government at the time, headed by P.W. Botha, who, in conjunction with Israeli assistance, was building nuclear bombs and chemical warfare programs, and quite prepared to use them, and was rather bewildered that the rest of the world was not very appreciative that we were saving the world from communism. That was the perception in South Africa in the mid-1980s. We were on the way to civil war. And the sanctions campaign was really the last non-violent hope that we could avert that civil war. Thank God it worked. South Africa is really the only instance where sanctions have worked, unlike, for instance, the US example with Cuba since the 1950s, or when Marilyn Albright tried to justify the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children, saying she thought it was worth it. So South Africa really remains, despite many times when sanctions have been used, sanctions have worked because we targeted the banks, primarily. One thing leads to the other. Boycotts conscientize people. Divestment also conscientizes and has impact, and I'll come back to that. But we targeted the banks, and in particular the 7 major New York banks, because of the role of the US dollar as settlement currency in foreign exchange markets. If you didn't have access to those 7 major banks, you couldn't trade with Europe or Japan or wherever. And because of Archbishop Tutu's network, we were able to prevail on the mainline churches here to pressure their bankers. The Episcopalians threatened Morgan Guarantee and Bank of New York. The Catholics threatened Manufacturers Hanover, and the Presbyterians threatened Chemical Bank. And the deal was, do you want our pension fund business or the business of apartheid South Africa? You make a choice. And when David Jenkins came into office, he added the payroll account of the city of New York, or apartheid South Africa. And to our own astonishment, President George Bush Sr. added his voice to it, to our astonishment. And in October 1989, we had 5 points we kept pushing as part of our agenda: the end of the state of emergency, release political prisoners, unban political organizations. 4 was repeal of apartheid legislation, and 5 was constitutional negotiations for a non-racial democracy. And in October 89, we had the March for Peace in Cape Town in September 89. In October 89, President Bush Sr.'s Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs issued an ultimatum to the South African government to comply with the first 3 of our conditions by February 1990, and that included the release of Nelson Mandela. And it was another 4 years of tough negotiations, but eventually we overcame the apartheid system and avoided a racial bloodbath. And as Tony said, thank you, but as Tony said, I came to this from a banking background. I was regional treasury manager for Nedbank in Cape Town, which meant covering international banking and also the domestic money market. And Nedbank had 20 years of sanctions busting experience because of the Rhodesian situation. We had a subsidiary in Rhodesia called Robank, and we covered for them. So we were experts in sanctions busting with dummy accounts and false letters of credit and, you name it. And of course, it was all done in the national interest. Yeah. So, the Rubicon speech, yes. Perchance, P.W. Botha told the world to go to hell in August 1985, and we had a financial crisis, and the rand collapsed. And perchance, I had a transaction going through the last business day of 1985 for $60 million US, and we were instructed to pay the dollars to Barclays Bank in New York, and our main correspondent in New York was Bankers Trust, and they grabbed our $60 million to set off against the $200 million that they'd lent to South Africa, and the whole New York payment system imploded. People with no connection with South Africa whatsoever, and apparently took about a week to put back together. Well, the South African Council of Churches said, whoa, if we can do this from Cape Town, that's the pressure point. So 6 weeks later, I was dispatched to Washington and New York to launch the banking sanctions campaign with Archbishop Tutu at the United Nations. And then we got it circulated through Congress, and the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act followed a year later. President Reagan vetoed it, and his veto was overturned, and as I say, bit by bit it was taken up. So even President Bush Sr. Came to the party in late '89. Yes, and to my astonishment, I was never arrested. The police were so bewildered as to why a quite conservative banker would be associated with these communist churchmen. Anyway, roll on from there. I've been unemployable since 1986, but being a peace activist is much more interesting, and I send my wife to work. She spent 22 years as Archbishop Tutu's secretary, and so it goes. Yeah. I've then been the whistleblower in what is known as the arms deal scandal in South Africa. Right after '94, the European governments put massive pressure on us to buy weapons with the story that you spend $5 billion on warships and warplanes we don't need, and they'll invest back $18 billion in offsets. Offsets is simply vehicles to pay bribes. And when I first heard about the bribes, I asked the British government to investigate why BAE, or British Aerospace, was laundering bribes through 2 Swedish trade unions. Scotland Yard was appointed to investigate, and it came back it was not illegal in English law to bribe foreigners, and therefore there was no crime to investigate. That was '98. We've made progress. For people who think we are not making progress, we've made progress. The man who actually laundered the bribes is now the Prime Minister of Sweden. Anyway, we're here to talk about Israel, really, and divestment. Since in 2009, 2010, I was a peace monitor at the checkpoints in Jerusalem and then Bethlehem. And then when the Russell Tribunal on Palestine met in Cape Town in 2011, I was the local organizing secretary when we brought 30 witnesses to discuss whether Israeli conduct towards Palestinians meets the legal criteria of apartheid as a crime against humanity. And as South Africans, we say, bad as apartheid was in South Africa, it is far, far worse in Israel-Palestine. We never had apartheid roads, apartheid walls, and the security, the permit system, is way beyond what we had. Let alone the targeting of people through drones in Gaza. And Gaza is now on the verge of, you can call it genocide, 2 million people facing genocide in Gaza. It's a terrible situation. I was back in Palestine in June with my wife. We were a group of about 20 people, 20 internationals, invited to meet the BDS committee in Ramallah and Nablus, and also the Israeli Coalition of Women for Peace in Tel Aviv. And the decision there was that we should be focusing on the Israeli armaments industry. And in particular in Elbit. Elbit produces most of the drones in Israel. It accounts for almost half of Israel's arms exports of $6.5 billion per year. Israel is now exporting weapons to 130 countries, including Myanmar. They've had a long, long relationship with the military dictatorship in Myanmar. There is a court case coming up on Monday in Tel Aviv, led by Itai Mak, an Israeli human rights lawyer, who's exposing the role of the Israelis in maintaining the Myanmar military dictatorship. And the Ministry of Defense has said, in response to his court application, that the court has no standing on this because this is a diplomatic issue. We'll see what happens on Monday. But in addition to that, in England, 5 British peace activists occupied the Elbit factory just outside Birmingham and closed it down for 2 days. The upshot of that was a court case in Cranach near Birmingham on the 13th of September. So as the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in Cape Town, we wrote to the court asking for the charges to be dismissed against these 5 peace activists, but in addition for the court to take cognizance of the fact that apartheid is a crime against humanity now in terms of the International Criminal Court, there's war crimes issues, there's genocide issues, and that not only should the court dismiss the charges against these activists, but more particularly they should issue an instruction to deal with the issues in terms of divestment and banking sanctions, which I'll come to in a moment. The happy news is that the charges were dismissed against 3 of the 5 peace activists. The case has now been postponed until November and transferred against the other 2 peace activists, and the case has now been transferred to Newcastle. So we've got another bite at this come in November. And as I say, we'll see what happens in Tel Aviv on Monday. Now, Elbit and the Israeli armaments industry, they export weapons to 130 countries. We in South Africa are particularly concerned about the consequences, for instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the Israeli armaments industry keeps the Kabila dictatorship in office. They provide the security, the weapons, against which they get concessions to plunder the natural resources in the Congo, the coltan, the copper, the cobalt, the diamonds, the gold, the timber, oil. And they launder the proceeds through the banking system back into the Israeli economy. The situation is known in the Congo as Africa's First World War. Between 5 and 10 million people have died in Africa's First World War. You don't see very much about it in the media here. We have massive numbers of refugees coming from the Congo, coming from Zimbabwe, into South Africa, more refugees than any other country in the world. But it's Africa's first world war. The Congo should be one of the wealthier countries in the world. It's a devastated society. I don't know if it'll ever be able to put it back together again. So we as the international community have an obligation to actually find a means of getting a handle on top of this. As a former international banker, obviously, and involved with our banking sanctions campaign, obviously the technology has advanced dramatically since the 1980s. You don't have to toy or have prayer breakfasts with Jesse Jackson outside Citibank, as I had in the 1980s before we stormed Citibank. We did some crazy things, but thankfully it worked. But now everything is computerized. And SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, is domiciled just outside Brussels at Le Hulpe. I, for some years, have been saying SWIFT is where we should be going. I did have a letter of introduction from Archbishop Tutu when I was in Brussels in 2014, and they refused to see me despite a letter of introduction from Archbishop Tutu. But I did manage to meet one of the directors of the National Bank of Belgium, the National Bank of Belgium has supervisory role over SWIFT, and she said, "You're being very hard on us. We poor Belgians have a very difficult road to tread with the Americans." Well, SWIFT succumbed to pressure from the United States to suspend Iran's membership of SWIFT, and that is now considered to have been the major element in bringing Iran to the nuclear weapons negotiations. So SWIFT sanctions work. SWIFT links 11,000 international banks in over 200 countries. It authenticates the payment transactions through those banks. And in a nutshell, if you don't get paid, you can't trade. All we need is a computer program. Every bank has a SWIFT code. The 5th and the 6th letter identifies the country of domicile. IL signifies Israel. All we need is a computer program suspending transactions to and from Israeli accounts, and then to leverage that up so that negotiations become possible between Palestinians and Israelis. The BDS campaign is modeled after our South African experience in the 1980s as a non-violent initiative. Of course, we're smeared continually as being anti-Semitic, and I would suggest that that's simply a smokescreen to disguise the war industry. And the role of the Israeli armaments industry and war business as surrogates for the United States in the Middle East and beyond. The objectives of the BDS campaign are to balance the scales, but what they're demanding is the release immediately of all Palestinian political prisoners. They have many, many more political prisoners than we ever had in South Africa, despite a fraction of the population. To end the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, and that the Israeli government will dismantle the apartheid wall. To recognize the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinians to full equality in Israel-Palestine. And 4, to acknowledge the right of return of Palestinian refugees.